Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Arizona GOP primaries for governor and Senate ahead of this Tuesday's primary elections. Now, Arizona is not the only state we'll be covering before Tuesday. We're also going to take a look at Kansas, Michigan, and Missouri, so stay tuned for those videos upcoming throughout the week until, of course, we get to the Tuesday primaries, which are probably going to be some of the most interesting of the entire primary cycle. But I want to zero in on Arizona first because I think this is the one getting the most attention, and rightfully so. It's further exemplifying the rift in the Republican Party between the establishment wing, the wing of the party that wants to move on from Donald Trump, and the Donald Trump wing of the party, which of course wants Trump to remain a central figure in the party and ultimately adopt his America First policies. So, this primary, like Maryland, is going to be another proxy battle between those two factions. And ultimately, we're going to take a look at the polling in both of these races, governor and Senate, as well as previous election results to kind of determine which candidates I think are likely to win in Tuesday's primary. So before we begin, please consider subscribing down below if you're new to the channel and liking this video if you enjoy. So we'll get straight into it. So if we take a look at the polls for governor so far, candidate Kari Lake is currently up in the aggregate by 8.5% over Karrin Taylor Robson. Now, Kari Lake is the Trump-endorsed candidate, the America First candidate in this race, and Taylor Robson is the generic Republican pick. She's endorsed by Mike Pence and Governor Doug Ducey. Now, throughout this primary, Kari Lake has always been the favorite to win this race. Taylor Robson originally was polling at basically -4%. She really wasn't known in the state, and then overall, as we get through the spring of 2022, and into the summer, she started to gain a lot more traction as some of these more minor candidates dropped out of the primary and ended up endorsing her. And ultimately, we're at a point now where both candidates are within single digits of each other. The latest poll, of course, has Kari Lake up by about 9 points, and there's a poll before that by Public Opinion Strategies that has them tied. But ultimately, Kari Lake is up ahead by a considerable amount, and the Trump endorsement certainly plays a huge factor in that. But the fact that Taylor Robson is so competitive in this race does tell an interesting story about GOP primary voters in general. Like in the state of Maryland, where we saw the matchup between Kelly Schulz, the establishment nominee, and the Trump-endorsed nominee, Dan Cox, it wasn't as lopsided as one would think. Trump's influence on the party is still very much there, but there are some Republicans that aren't only supporting candidates because they're endorsed by Donald Trump, and that's one of the reasons why Taylor Robson has as much support as she does. All of her support so far is in the mid-30s, and her highest amount is 43%. Now, ultimately, based on the polling, and of course based on what we've seen in other primaries in Maryland and Pennsylvania, I think the Trump-endorsed candidate is going to win for governor. I think Kari Lake, at the end of the day, is probably going to win this primary, and I think she's likely to win by double digits. She's going to overperform the polling. Now, Arizona has a reputation of somewhat being a more neoconservative state, being represented by people such as John McCain, Jeff Flake, and some would even consider Doug Ducey in that umbrella. But ultimately, it's more of a mixed bag than that because a lot of Republican nominees from Arizona, especially on the congressional level, are very much part of the Trump wing. Paul Gosar comes to mind, Andy Biggs, are some examples of that. But if we take a look at the 2016 primary results, back in March even, Donald Trump won the state of Arizona pretty overwhelmingly when you still had people like Marco Rubio and John Kasich in the race trying to stop Trump from getting the Republican nomination. But ultimately, in the state of Arizona, it didn't go anywhere. So even though Arizona has this complicated relationship with President Trump, even its GOP having some nominees that were openly anti-Trump, this is still a state where Trump has a large amount of influence. And we saw that in the state of Maryland as well, which was also overwhelmingly won by Trump in both the 2016 and, of course, the 2020 Republican primaries. But Kari Lake is somebody that has a number of controversies attached to her. There's been some from the Robson campaign that have accused her of being a closeted Democrat. Kari Lake was previously a Democrat in the Obama years, and before that, she's also a journalist. And there's been a number of attacks on both sides of this. Taylor Robson has been accused of being a rhino, given her support for Governor Doug Ducey, as well as being on the opposite side of the election issue as Donald Trump. So ultimately, it's been a very ugly, divisive primary, similar to what we saw in the Pennsylvania Senate primary. And, one thing that I think is a bit different about this primary, though, is that Taylor Robson, who is on track to lose, I think, this primary, has agreed to endorse Kari Lake if she is the nominee. Now, that's something we haven't seen in other Republican primaries. Of course, Larry Hogan famously a couple of days ago said he would not endorse Dan Cox for governor, And Kathy Barnett, the third place candidate in the Pennsylvania Republican primary, has still up to this point refused to endorse Dr. Oz for Senate. So there have been a number of divisive primaries throughout this cycle where the losing Republican refuses to endorse the winner. And in some cases, I think that very much hurts the GOP in a year that they otherwise should be doing exceptionally well given the national circumstances. But ultimately, for the governor's primary, I think Kari Lake will end up winning by about anywhere from 11 to 14 points when it's all said and done. And while Arizona has been trending more and more Democrat, the seat itself, the governorship, has stayed in Republican hands. On the same ballot that Kyrsten Sinema beat Martha McSally by 2.4%, Doug Ducey won a landslide victory against progressive Democrat David Garcia. Of course, this was also his re-election bid. Now, this is one of many examples where you have popular Republican incumbents beating out the national environment in 2018 and overperforming down ballot and federal races. Now, Doug Ducey can't run for a third term, and honestly, if he did, he might even lose a primary given the current political environment. But nonetheless, Doug Ducey is still a big figure in Arizona Republican politics because he still does have a base, even if it is much smaller than Trump's base. And him getting behind Taylor Robson, of course, Mike Pence getting behind Taylor Robson also, kind of fuels this notion of a proxy war. Obviously, Trump and Pence, since the election of 2020, haven't really been the best of friends, to put it mildly. And ultimately, it's just drawing the battle lines for the Republican rift that we're seeing throughout the primary cycle. Now, if we jump over to the Senate primary for the Republicans, it's about just as competitive. Blake Masters, who is the Trump-endorsed candidate, has about a 9.5-point lead. Kari Lake had about an 8.5-point lead over his leading opponent, Mark Brnovich and Jim Lamon. Although, in the latest polls, Jim Lamon has actually been coming in second. Blake Masters is still in first. Now, this is very interesting because this kind of reminds me of the Ohio Republican primary in that you had an heir apparent early on in Ohio. It was Josh Mandel, who eventually got overshadowed by the Trump-endorsed pick, in this case, Blake Masters. In Ohio, of course, it was J.D. Vance. But then you had a last-minute surge from a non-Trump-endorsed candidate. In Ohio, we had Matt Dolan, and in Arizona, it looks like Jim Lamon is going to take up that mantle. Ultimately, I think the same result will end up prevailing. I think Blake Masters, the Trump-endorsed candidate, will end up beating out Jim Lamon and Mark Brnovich at the end of the day, probably by a similar margin that Kari Lake beats Taylor Robson. Now, I think Blake Masters will win by a bit more, since this primary has been a bit less divisive than the governor primary. I think Blake Masters probably will end up winning by about 15, 16 points, which is interesting because, there are some crossover support. You have Taylor Robson supporters who are backing Blake Masters, and you have Kari Lake supporters that are backing Jim Lamon. So it is a really interesting sort of primary. Most of the Trump loyalists are backing the endorsees, but there is a bit more crossover, which is why Blake Masters is leading by slightly more than Kari Lake. But nonetheless, I still think the Trump-endorsed candidates will end up winning at the end of the day. And, hopefully for the Republicans, the Republican base coalesces around the nominees into November, because Arizona won't be exactly a shoo-in for the Republicans to win. 2022 is still going to be very competitive in the state of Arizona, especially on the Senate level, because you do have a pretty strong incumbent in Mark Kelly. While Joe Biden won the state of Arizona by only 0.3%, Mark Kelly on the exact same ballot ended up winning by about 2.4%. Now, he overperformed Biden, which means he ended up getting Trump voters as well. Obviously a very small amount, but he still had to get some Donald Trump voters as well, and probably some independents in order to beat Martha McSally. Interestingly enough, Martha McSally was also the Republican nominee back in 2018. Martha McSally has the unflattering distinction of losing 2 consecutive Senate races in the state of Arizona, and some blame her for being the reason why Arizona's 2 Senate seats are currently held by Democrats, because Arizona is a state that does split ticket. We saw that in 2018 in a big way with Doug Ducey, but even in the 2020 Senate race, where Martha McSally underperformed Trump, and even though it was just by a little bit, it was enough to make a difference in both of these races. Ultimately, Mark Kelly is going to be a formidable incumbent to beat. Obviously, he won by 2.4% in 2020, and he has a lot of money and establishment backing from Democratic groups and even independent groups that have since turned away from the Republican Party. Mark Kelly has tried to position himself as a more centrist, moderate Democrat, not as much as a Kyrsten Sinema, but as somebody who could be seen as pragmatic and working across the aisle. Obviously, it's up to the voters of Arizona to decide whether they agree with that characterization or not. but Republicans will be energized in 2022. And regardless, it's still going to be a tough race for both contenders. And I think it's going to be very close. There's a reason why I've put the race in Arizona for Senate as tilt Republican. I still think Republicans have the advantage in this race in the general, but I still think it's going to be very close, considering that Mark Kelly, I think, is a pretty strong incumbent and has shown to be polling a lot better than other Democratic incumbents in other states, such as Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada, or even in some cases, Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire. But ultimately, Arizona is a state that still votes to the right of the nation by about 4 points. And at the end of the day, I expect this seat to stay in Republican hands, as with the governorship as well, given the midterm environment. But in regular general elections, I do think the Arizona GOP needs to work harder to try and run candidates that can appeal to a broader electorate, because Arizona is a state that is trending to the left. It went from in 2012 being a likely Republican state, in 2016 being a lean Republican state, to now where it has become a tilt Democratic state on the presidential level. So ultimately, a huge shift toward the Democratic Party in Arizona, partly because of Trump. There is an anti-Trump faction of voters in Arizona, especially in Maricopa County in the suburbs. But ultimately, these are trends that aren't unique to Arizona. They've been seen around the entire country as well. Ultimately, I think Kari Lake and Blake Masters will be the nominees for the Republican Party for the governor and Senate races in Arizona. And ultimately, I think Trump is going to win this proxy battle between the establishment. We've seen this many times throughout Republican primaries this cycle in Maryland and in many other states, where you've had establishment Republicans going up against the Trump-endorsed candidates. The only time Trump-endorsed candidates seem to really lose is when their personal scandals outweigh the benefits of a Trump endorsement. We saw that in Nebraska with Herbster, that had a number of sexual misconduct allegations, which ultimately tanked his campaign and led to the nomination of Jim Pillen, who was an establishment Republican, but is still a very conservative individual. So really, there's a lot more nuance in this ideological battle, but ultimately, I think the Trump wing will prevail in the state of Arizona come Tuesday's primary elections. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you did. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.